On the cold night of November 10, 1973, 58-year-old Grand Ole Opry star David "Stringbean" Akeman walked off the stage of the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville, carrying his banjo case and a small paper sack containing his evening pay. He and his wife, Estelle, climbed into their faded station wagon and drove home to their secluded wooden cabin in Ridgetop, Tennessee, looking forward to a quiet night in the woods before a Sunday morning hunting trip with his close friend, Grandpa Jones. He didn't know yet that two men were already sitting inside his dark living room, listening to his live performance on his own console radio, waiting in the shadows with loaded handguns. He didn't know yet that before the night was over, both he and Estelle would be lying dead in the freezing mud of their front yard over a handful of pocket cash. And he certainly didn't know that the fortune his killers brutalized him for wouldn't be found by police, robbers, or treasure hunters. It would sit untouched inside his fireplace chimney for the next 23 years, slowly rotting into mouse food, while his murderers served life in prison. Most of the tragedy was about to unfold, but the real insult was still decades away. I'm Roman. Welcome to Country Mysteries. To understand David Akeman, you have to understand a specific kind of rural fear that money cannot fix once it gets into a child's blood. Long before anyone called him Stringbean, long before millions of Americans tuned in every Saturday night to watch a 6'5" lanky man tell jokes in a cornfield, David was a boy growing up in the dirt-poor hills of Annville, Jackson County, Kentucky, watching the American banking system collapse around his family. In 1929, when local banks locked their doors overnight and wiped out lifetime savings across rural Appalachia, the Akeman family learned a lesson that was carved straight into David's mind. Paper money inside a bank vault wasn't security, it was a trap. A bank was a place where strangers in three-piece suits took your sweat and handed you back an empty piece of paper. A real instrument, on the other hand, was something you could hold in your hand. His father, James Akeman, was a local clawhammer banjo player who picked tunes at mountain dances to keep flour in the family pantry. 7-year-old David had no money for a real banjo, so he built one out of a discarded cardboard shoebox and cotton thread, plucking it in the dark until his fingertips bled. By age 12, he executed his very first major financial deal, trading a pair of prize bantam chickens he had raised himself for a battered wooden banjo. As Akeman later recalled in a rare 1968 radio interview, his voice still carrying the dry gravel of the Kentucky hills, "I raised those chickens from chicks. And when I saw that old banjo sitting in the window, I knew the chickens had to go. They was good chickens, but they couldn't play no tunes." It wasn't a bad return on investment, considering a pair of chickens rarely gets anyone a 40-year career in national show business. During the 1930s, David joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, swinging heavy axes and building gravel roads across Kentucky to send $22 a month back home to his mother. But music was his real escape hatch. He hit the local talent show circuit, where veteran bandleader Asa Martin spotted him on stage in Lexington. Martin forgot David's real name during the live radio introduction, took one look at his 6'5", 140-pound frame, and shouted into the microphone, "Come on up here, Stringbean." The crowd roared, the nickname stuck, and David Akeman never looked back. But that childhood trauma of 1929 stayed right beside him. As he packed his bags for Nashville years later, Stringbean brought along a rule he repeated to anyone who would listen. Never, under any circumstances, leave your hard-earned cash where a banker can touch it. And honestly, looking at how many rural families were completely wiped out during the Great Depression, you can understand the instinct. The problem was that hiding cash at home in the remote hills of Tennessee carried a very different, far more lethal kind of danger. By the early 1940s, Stringbean was picking banjo in the traditional clawhammer style, a rhythmic, downstroke technique that sounded like a galloping horse, even as younger musicians were abandoning it for modern three-finger picking. In 1942, the father of bluegrass, Bill Monroe, hired Stringbean as the very first official banjo player for the Bluegrass Boys. Monroe admitted in the 1970 retrospective interview, "Stringbean couldn't pick as fast as Earl Scruggs came along and did later. But String had a rhythm and a heart in his playing that kept the whole crowd moving, and he knew how to make people laugh when things got tough." While touring the Southern Circuit with Monroe, Stringbean stumbled onto the stage persona that would define him for the rest of his life. He adopted an absurd costume, an oversized, long-sleeved nightshirt tucked into a pair of short blue jeans belted down around his knees. The outfit visually exaggerated his elongated torso and stubby legs, turning his physical presence into an instant comedy routine before he even plucked a string. It takes a special kind of confidence to step onto a national stage looking like your trousers fell halfway down during a minor earth tremor. But in Nashville, that passed for pure comedic genius. In 1945, Stringbean left Monroe's band and fell under the wing of country music pioneer Uncle Dave Macon. Uncle Dave was an eccentric Opry legend who shared more than just musical technique with Stringbean. He shared the exact same deep financial paranoia. Uncle Dave famously mistrusted banks, carrying thousands of dollars from show earnings tucked into cloth bags pinned to the inside of his heavy wool vest. Uncle Dave used to shout backstage, "I don't trust any bank that can lock its doors on a Monday morning and tell me my money is gone." When Uncle Dave Macon passed away in 1952, Stringbean didn't just inherit his spot as the Grand Ole Opry's premier folk comedian. He inherited his mentor's habit of walking around with his life savings stuffed into his clothes and hidden in his home. Around this time, Stringbean married Estelle Stanfill. Estelle wasn't just a passive country wife waiting at home. She was an accomplished musician in her own right, a skilled mandolin player, and a fierce protector of her husband's quiet life. People who knew the couple described their bond as unbreakable. Together, they bought a modest wooden cabin without indoor plumbing near Ridgetop, Tennessee, 20 miles north of Nashville. Stringbean was finally a featured Opry star, earning steady money, and every greenback he brought home went straight into secret hiding spots scattered around the cabin. He felt safe in his woods. But as his fame grew, rumors about what was hidden inside those unpretentious wooden walls began to circulate across Tennessee. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Stringbean became one of the most beloved figures at the Grand Ole Opry, performing week after week at the historic Ryman Auditorium. His comedic novelty songs, like Chewing Gum and I'm Going to Make Dirt Fly, had audiences stomping their feet in the wooden pews. Opry legend Grandpa Jones wrote in his 1984 autobiography, "String was as honest as the day is long. He didn't care about shiny Cadillacs, fancy suits, or diamond rings. He liked fishing, playing his banjo, and living simple out in the woods with Estelle." In 1969, Stringbean's national profile exploded when he joined the original cast of the syndicated television show Hee Haw. Alongside Buck Owens, Roy Clark, and Minnie Pearl, Stringbean became a prime-time favorite across North America. His recurring segments, pulling his letter from home out of his oversized hip pocket and cracking jokes while sitting in a cornfield, turned him into a household name. Country star Minnie Pearl later recalled, "String was the gentlest soul on the Opry stage. He was completely untouched by television fame. When he got his big Hee Haw checks, he just folded them up, put them in his pocket, and went back to his cabin." With heavy television paychecks added to his Opry income, Stringbean was making serious money. But while his peers bought sprawling estates in Brentwood or drove luxury cars, Stringbean and Estelle didn't change a single thing. He kept driving his faded station wagon, hunting his own dinner, and visiting local banks only to exchange smaller bills for crisp $100 notes. In Nashville, when a national TV star continues to live in a cabin without indoor plumbing, people don't assume he's broke. They assume his mattress is stuffed with gold brick. Whispers spread through Davidson and Robertson counties that the tall banjo player kept vast fortunes buried under floorboards or stashed in his walls. Friends grew alarmed, and warned him about the target he was painting on his back. Opry star Little Jimmy Dickens recalled years later, "I told String more than once, 'String, you need to put that money in a vault before somebody comes looking for it.' He'd just grin that big grin of his and say, 'Jimmy, nobody's ever gonna bother old Stringbean. Everybody knows I'm just an old country boy.'" That grin and the mountain innocence behind it was about to meet the darkest reality of 1970s Nashville. By late 1973, Stringbean was 58 years old, enjoying the peak of his career. He and Estelle were deeply content with their simple routine of gardening, fishing, and tending to their hunting dogs. But the persistent rumors of Stringbean's cash stash had floated out of the Opry dressing rooms and into Nashville's criminal underbelly. Two 23-year-old cousins, John A. Brown Jr. and Marvin Douglas Doug Brown, got wind of the rumors. Neither man had a steady job. Both had criminal records for petty theft and burglary, and both became convinced that Stringbean's cabin held tens of thousands of dollars in easy cash. On Saturday evening, November 10, 1973, while Stringbean and Estelle were in Nashville for their scheduled performance at the Grand Ole Opry, John and Doug Brown drove out to Ridgetop. They broke through a window, searched the living room, flipped sofa cushions, pulled out drawers, and found virtually nothing. Not in the furniture, not under the floorboards, not behind the walls. Instead of running away after finding an empty house, the cousins did something that chills the spine. They sat down in Stringbean's living room, turned on his console radio, and waited in the dark for the couple to return. If there is a more haunting image in country music history, it is the sight of two armed felons sitting inside a dark cabin, listening to the live WSM broadcast of the Grand Ole Opry, where their intended victim was on stage performing at that very second. Back at the Ryman Auditorium, Stringbean put on a fantastic show. Backstage, he joked warmly with his close friend Grandpa Jones, telling him he couldn't wait for their joint hunting trip the next morning. Grandpa Jones remembered Stringbean saying, "Louis, get your gun ready early tomorrow. We're going to get us some good game." Around 10:30 p.m., Stringbean and Estelle packed up their instruments, folded his performance pay into a paper sack, and drove off into the cold autumn night toward Ridgetop. They pulled into their driveway at 11 p.m., completely unaware of the trap waiting for them inside. Stringbean parked the station wagon. As he stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch, his boot caught something in the dark, a thin fishing line he had strung across the driveway as a crude homemade alarm system. It had been broken. Someone had already come through. He reached into his overalls for his .22 revolver and stepped carefully toward the front door. But John Brown was already standing in the dark with a gun raised. Before Stringbean could lift his arm, John Brown fired 3 times into his chest. Stringbean collapsed onto the floor by the doorway. Outside in the car, Estelle heard the shots ring out through the quiet country night. Panicking, she didn't try to start the car and drive away. She leaped out and ran toward the road, screaming for help. A neighboring farmer later testified in court, "I heard the shots echo across the ridge, and then I heard a woman's voice crying out desperately in the dark, screaming, 'Please don't! Please don't!' Then there was another shot. Doug Brown ran after Estelle, caught her in the yard, and shot her 3 times in the head. The 2 intruders had just executed a brutal double murder of 2 defenseless, gentle people, all for a robbery payout that wouldn't even cover a week's worth of cheap liquor. Panicked by the noise of the gunshots, the Brown cousins hastily searched Stringbean's pockets, taking roughly $250 in cash and his gold pocket watch. They also grabbed several firearms from the cabin and a chainsaw. Unable to locate the rumored hidden fortune anywhere else in the mess, they ran into the woods, leaving Stringbean and Estelle dead in the mud. Early the next morning, Sunday, November 11th, Grandpa Jones drove out to the cabin, expecting to go hunting with his buddy. Approaching the house, he noticed the station wagon door wide open. Walking toward the porch, he saw Estelle lying face down in the grass. Seconds later, He looked through the front door and found Stringbean on the floor. A tearful Grandpa Jones testified in court, his voice shaking. I reached down and touched String's arm, and he was cold. I knew right then that somebody had done a terrible, terrible thing to two of the finest people who ever lived. The news devastated Nashville. The murders marked what musicians and historians call the end of innocence for country music. Stars who had lived openly without locks or security suddenly put up chain-link fences, hired bodyguards, and bought attack dogs. Opry legend Roy Acuff remarked bitterly to reporters, "Country music will never be the same again. We used to leave our doors wide open. Now we're all living behind iron bars." Nashville police launched a massive manhunt. Within days, tips led detectives straight to John and Doug Brown. Investigators found Stringbean's stolen pocket watch hidden on property connected to the cousins, alongside firearms matching those taken from the cabin and handguns matching the ballistics of the murder bullets. On November 2, 1974, after a gripping trial in Nashville, both John Brown and Doug Brown were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Because Tennessee had temporarily struck down its death penalty law at the time, both men received consecutive life sentences. Doug Brown died in prison in 2003. John Brown served 41 years before being controversially granted parole in November 2014, a decision that sparked outrage among surviving Opry veterans and country fans nationwide. Opry legend Gene Shepard blasted the parole board, stating publicly, "Giving that murderer his freedom is a slap in the face to Stringbean, to Estelle, and to everyone who loved them." And honestly, watching a cold-blooded killer walk free after 41 years while his victims never got to grow old is a bitter pill for anyone who values justice. But the final tragic irony of Stringbean's money was still waiting inside the cabin walls. Stringbean's death forever changed Nashville, replacing small-town trust with high-tech security. But the story had one final, unbelievable chapter, 23 years after the crime. In 1996, the new owner of Stringbean's old cabin decided to remodel the living room fireplace. As workers tore down the decaying brickwork inside the chimney flue, they uncovered a hidden cavity behind a loose brick. Inside was a plastic pouch crumbling with age. Inside that pouch was Stringbean's legendary hidden stash, approximately $20,000 in paper currency, mostly in crisp $100 bills. The money Stringbean had died to protect, and the fortune 2 young men had committed double murder to find, had been sitting inside the chimney of the very room where the killers waited in the dark. However, 23 years of damp chimney soot, fireplace heat, and nesting mice had taken a terrible toll. The bills were rotted, chewed to shreds, and reduced to green pulp. Federal Reserve officials in Atlanta were brought in to salvage the remains, but only a fraction of the bills could be verified for redemption. On Hee Haw, the producers made a touching decision. They chose never to replace Stringbean. Instead, his iconic scarecrow costume remained standing in the cornfield set for years as a silent, heartbreaking tribute to the tall man with the clawhammer banjo. Hee Haw producer Sam Lavallo later wrote in his memoir that in the cornfield, that the show's cast never fully recovered from the loss, describing Stringbean as irreplaceable, a word Lavallo said he rarely used about anyone. Stringbean spent his whole life distrusting banks because he believed paper money inside a vault wasn't safe. In the end, his money survived him by 23 years, only to be eaten by mice inside a chimney wall while his killers went to prison. It is one of the most heartbreaking and absurd endings in country music history. A man who brought laughter and music to millions was taken away over $250 in pocket change and a pile of cash that nobody ever got to spend. What do you think about the parole of Stringbean's killer in 2014? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to Country Mysteries, and share this episode with fellow country music fans. Next time on Country Mysteries, the story of Merle Haggard, from an inmate sitting in San Quentin watching Johnny Cash perform live, to receiving a full presidential pardon and becoming the voice of the working man. I'm Roman. Thanks for watching, and welcome to Country Mysteries.